On Tuesday, the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Timipre Sylva, reiterated the sentiment expressed by his predecessor in office when he cast doubt on Nigeria's daily petrol consumption figures. Sylva, in an interview with Nigerian Television Authority, said the numbers were crazy and opaque. The minister affirmed that the numbers churned out by Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, the sole importer of petroleum in the country, were questionable, and the best solution to the problem was to end the fuel subsidy regime. Realistically, Sylva did not say anything new, as his predecessor in the ministry, Dr. Ibe Kachiku, had also queried the numbers on daily domestic demand for petrol in 2015, which at the time were estimated at 30 to 35 million litres per day. Today, the NNPC claims domestic demand for petrol ranges anywhere between 50 million litres per day and over 100 million litres per day. The opacity in the figures has been blamed on NNPC being the sole importer of petrol, systemic corruption, and the room for arbitrage that encourages smuggling of millions of litres of cheaper Nigerian petrol to neighboring countries, where it is sold at much higher prices. Now joining us to discuss this age-old problem, which successive administrations have failed to address, is Afolabi Oladele, a former Group Executive Director, Refineries and Petrochemicals of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. Oladele is a chemical engineer, seasoned oil and gas expert, and is the chairman of First Hydrocarbon Nigeria, an independent indigenous oil and gas exploration and production company. Welcome to the show, Mr. Oladele, and good morning.
Good morning, Tudu. Thank you for having me.
Well, Mr. Oladele, thank you for joining us. Well, you had Tundu's introduction. We don't even know how much finished products, our petrol we consume in this country. The numbers keep going up and down. And we have the testimony of the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Chief Timipre Sylva, saying that it's opaque, it's crazy. What exactly are we dealing with here? Wastages, crude oil theft, fraud, or negligence on the part of certain government departments?
Well, thank you, Ruben. You asked a very critical question. And if one were to just answer you, one would say it's a combination of every one of those things that you mentioned. Since 2019, NNPC stopped publishing. When I say stop publishing, I mean in the public media. The last time they put data in the Punch, in newspapers, was in 2019. And that was after the Nigerian Academy of Engineering did a symposium that actually challenged the state of refining and distribution of petroleum products in Nigeria. At that time, and I'm giving you data that's about 3 years old now, I'm talking of 2018 data, average petrol importation, PMS importation into the country is about 54.2 million litres a day. The question is, what is NNPC reporting? Is it average daily importation that they are equating with average consumption? That will be very, very defective. It's unlikely, based on the dynamics of the economy, that we would be looking at that kind of number, 54.2 million litres. If that was the level of consumption, it will be very questionable. Now, I would like to cast your mind back to the days of Okunjo-Iweala. Senator Magnus Abe, who was then in the Senate, actually commissioned a forensic audit in which my office at that time, African Capital Alliance, offered to help. And the outcome of the forensic audit showed that even the numbers that were reported as being imported were very defective. There were cases of bills of lading that were forged, vessels that never really arrived in Nigeria. I think this data must still be available within the Senate coffers. Senator Abe, who commissioned that work at that time, understood what the issues were facing at that because people were using fake numbers to get subsidy. So in a way, you find that aspect of fraud that you spoke to, have that aspect of giving wrong data in terms of whether it's importation that you are equating with consumption, And the system just lacks the checks and balances that used to prevail in the days when you had DPR, Department of Petroleum Resources, that actually obtained data from all the oil marketing companies in terms of what they sold. Now, since the oil marketing companies don't import products directly anymore, all that responsibility has gone away from the oil marketing companies. It's whatever the NNPC reports, that's what we have to stay with. I don't know if that helps in any way, but I can say that based on data that was published last in 2019, what we are known to be showing the public is the level of average importation per day. And I don't think that should be equated with level of consumption, excuse me.
Well, thank you for that clarification. It's really important,
Yeah,
Mr. Oladele. My question for you now, I'm not sure if you've heard of the repeated proposals from the Controller General of Customs, Hamid Ali. His idea is that NNPC should establish fuel stations in neighboring countries because it's the price differential that's responsible for a lot of the smuggling that we see, and that will stem that issue. That's his idea. What's your take on that?
Well, that NNPC is putting products or putting petrol stations in neighboring countries. It's a chase in the wild, if I can use those words. I recall Oando, many years ago, actually set up a station, set up petroleum stations, marketing stations in Togo. And I think those stations are still operating today. To the extent that individuals are able to carry products abroad, across the border, whether you set up an NPC sets up stations there, it's not going to stop the individuals who are benefiting from these cross-border price differentials. Just to give you a take, in November 2021, Cable put out some data with respect to prices in Nigeria compared to prices in Togo and the Republic of Benin. Nigerian prices were roughly 50%. Precisely, given the exchange rate prevailing at that time, petroleum products, particularly PMS, was selling at about 368 naira per litre in Republic of Benin and 357 naira per litre in Togo. I'm using these two just as examples, while our prices have remained at 162. Now, whether NNPC puts petroleum stations in those places, it's not going to stop the smart Nigerian who knows the way across the border, whether it's by the creeks or whichever, to take advantage of that price differential. So I think Mr. Controller General or whatever you called him must just have been trying to fly a kite. I don't think it's going to work. You can check with Oando, because Oandos, I believe, still have their outlets out there in Togo. Have those outlets functioned the way they expected them to function? Have they stopped or stemmed the moving of products? I haven't been in any of those countries in recent years, but you will find a lot of the products are sold in bottles, in jerry cans along the road. So whether you set up stations or not, I'm not sure that's going to cut the issue.
Well, two questions, sir. And the first one, no offense intended. Because you talked about forensic audit, and I wanted to draw your attention to that. If we're going to do a proper audit in the oil and gas sector, whether upstream or downstream, is it not better to look for, players that are not involved within the local environment, people who are, or companies that are completely neutral and independent, go beyond the big five, who in my view may already have been compromised by the Nigerian system? Don't you think that the auditors themselves are part of the problem? And then the second thing, in February 2021, the Department of Petroleum Resources, DPR, was talking about digitization, leveraging technology to monitor consumption in the downstream sector, what they call the DRMS solution, which was also intended to check smuggling. So what happened to that whole leveraging of technology, digitization that so much noise was made about?
Well, Ruben, let me start from the second question. I don't know how DPR intended to deploy that technology. We can talk about things. Execution is another story. And now that DPR is no longer in existence, whoever took over from them, they probably will be better placed to answer that question. But to your first question in terms of independent auditors, I couldn't agree more. If we need to get to the root of this, it's worth a try. If you want to use fresh hands who don't have any vested interest, so to say, in the country. Now, let's look at what really happens when you are bringing products into the country. In the days of old, you would have an independent inspector who actually not only takes haulage of the vessel or the tank from which you are going to be delivering products, they also will take haulage data in the tank into which you are delivering. Now, how is that still being done today? I don't know. I've been away from the system now 23 years. And if it's been done, are the people doing it, are they above board? And that's why your question is relevant. So that if we need to begin to look at a fresh start, it's also useful to look at in the fresh hands who have not been tainted or who don't have vested interest in the way things are done here, to begin to look at the proper ways of measurements when you are delivering from vessels into land tankage. That way, at least, you are able to determine what is actually delivered. I alluded to the fact that a number of the bills of lading that were unearthed, which DPR also had access to at that time, I'm talking of 2015, 2016, just before Magnus Abe left the Senate. They knew that there were bills of lading that had been counted as being approved for the products delivery that never actually came to Nigeria. They just were fake bills of lading. So there are so many dimensions to this that it leaves not to be desired. But I would not expect that NNPC would be part of such a thing where vessels are said to have come and they never really showed up. But it's worth looking at. It's worth looking at.
What is your take, sir, on what the Minister of State for Petroleum, Timipre Sylva, said when the government took the issue of subsidy removal off the table and sort of shelved it for the next administration to handle, kick the can down the road by 18 months? He said there's certain contingencies. The refineries, he talks about the Port Harcourt refinery, which is supposed to be starting, it won't be fully operational, but there's some progress being made with Port Harcourt. He didn't mention the other refineries. He mentioned the Dangote refinery, which is supposed to be kicking off in September. He mentioned compressed natural gas, that process of converting 1 million cars is to begin come March. What is your take on all of these rather hazy projections there?
Well, Chief Sylva, I'm sure he has his reasons for the things that he said. But our struggle with the issue of subsidy dates way back to the days of Babangida. And I recall very clearly when late Lukman, and I was just his briefcase carrier at that time, we went to make a presentation to the general with respect to how the nation was bleeding. And I say this because it's not a new problem. We are like little children who are being weaned from being breastfed. And for a bit of time, the child is going to be crying and so on, wailing. But we just never had the courage to say, look, we're going to put an end to this subsidy. And subsidy, yes, people talk about it. We must understand that it's going to be something that is very, very volatile. There are 4 basic elements. First of all, our exchange rates are not stable. Number 2, crude oil prices are very volatile. Number 3, you also have the argument that, there is an economic price at which crude oil should be charged to Nigerians, which people say should be our production cost. Now, if you wanted to go that route, then people will argue and say, well, there's really no subsidy. Your cost of production today is roughly $20 a barrel. You are selling oil at 65. But developmental impact, which people don't see, is what is hitting all the state governments today. If you permit me to go back to the data that I just was referring to in 2018, even at that level of 52, level of importation of 52 million liters of petrol per day, you would have had to refine close to 700,000 barrels of oil a day to be able to meet that level of petroleum products. But please walk back to how much is the crude oil that government itself is getting from joint venture operations. In 2018, 2019, the country was still doing 1.8 million barrels a day. At that time, the share of the Nigerian government in terms of crude oil from joint venture operations, which you could give if you decided to say, I'm going to give, was less than what we were importing. Sorry, it was significantly less than what we would have had to pay based on the level of imports. And that's what's showing up today. Nigeria is hardly producing, exporting about 1.3 million barrels a day, as against the quota of 1.6 that OPEC gave us. About that 300,000 barrels a day is stolen. You heard Tony Elumelu really moaning out loud at Kuru. And it's not Tony Elumelu alone. Every producer in this country is suffering from crude theft. But the real impact on the states is the fact that whatever the share of crude oil that belongs to NNPC or the Nigerian government, which they would normally have had to tender to get petroleum products into the country, is far, far more than what the government is entitled to. That's why they are not getting any money. So the impact is much more pervasive than just talking about the numbers being opaque and then the subsidy issue. The subsidy issue is real, but I caveat that because of the arguments of those who talk about, well, the actual production cost to us is much lower than the market price. But the counter-argument to that is if you went along with that, you are going to end up in a situation that every barrel that should be produced, sold, and put in the federation account for the states would actually end up in this vortex that we find ourselves. And it's a tough one, but it's the reality we have to face. We have to get away from it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we are on a slippery slope, a very slippery slope.
Okay, Mr. Oladele, there was a subject we discussed earlier today on this program, which is the blowout that has been reported at an FPSO vessel facility somewhere in Escravos, Western Niger Delta. And this is coming shortly after we had that other incident on the Santa Barbara River with regard to an IETO wellhead in November, December. And then, of course, pipeline explosion is so common on the Escravos route. What exactly are we, confronting? Could this be sabotage? Could it be some people, trying to construct a force majeure? Or there are more fundamental issues with, oil and gas infrastructure in Nigeria? As someone who is in that industry, what are your observations?
Well, thanks, Ruben. I think I'll take that in three different angles. One is the status of the infrastructure. Let's face it. The SEPCO facility that you spoke about was built 46 years ago, that FPSO. I don't know what the maintenance culture has been. A 46-year-old vessel that's not subject to the constant check and then all the maintenance facilities, maintenance work that need to be done should in fact probably not be in the system. But let's assume that it is being maintained. The quality of personnel that we have I grew up in this industry before I left in 1996, 1999. The rigor and the training that we went through in terms of attachment to the international oil companies, secondments, and so on, we were able to operate at par with our colleagues who were operating facilities outside of the country. Now, level of training of Nigerian and the competence to be able to deal with the degradation that we are seeing in infrastructure is something that is questionable. One of my senior colleagues in the industry, Egbati Momo, made a very serious point on this issue of quality and the competence of the people who are manning our infrastructure in the oil and gas industry. Let's not forget that many of these things have been there for 50, 60 years. And given our maintenance culture, given the way in which budgets are cut and the government wants to control everything, that infrastructure is disaster waiting to happen. I'll give an example of one of the pipelines that we took over in our operations from Shell when we took on OML 26. We constantly had to do the pigging of our lines to be sure that the integrity was intact. I don't know how much of this is being done at all levels. I can't speak for ITO, but every one of us, the independent oil producers, we must have our feet held to the fire in the same way as that's been done for the internationals as long as they are here. And I like to believe that it's part of this broken down systems and the fact that we're almost operating in the peripheries of what is legal in the way we run things, that's bringing us to the situation where we are seeing the kind of issues that we are faced with today. So I'll point my fingers at the age of the facilities. I'll point my finger at the quality and the competence of training, at the level of training that we have given to the generations that have succeeded us to be able to do what is required to be done. And it's part of enforcing the law for all of us who are producing to be sure that we don't operate below what is the norm that's accepted everywhere. Now, as for the things you spoke about, I hate to comment on that, but even for us, FHN that I chair, we suffer the same issues. In the month of December alone, 90% of what we produced to be put on the TNP was stolen before it got to the Bonny terminal. And that's just as bad as it is. That small company lost $100 million of funds that tax would have gone to government, royalty and PPT would have gone to government, but that disappeared into people's pockets. So it's a terrible situation that we are faced with. I can't say more than that, but the whole system needs a shake-up.
Well, another terrible situation for you, sir, to chew on is Nigeria's production underperformance and how we're just not meeting our OPEC quota. I'd like your analysis on the factors behind that and what should be done.
Well, I alluded to that. We produce and we put into pipelines. Let me give you the history in the Western Delta, where we, as FHN, we operate. In October, get my months right now, August, September, October, we had, at some point in time, the pipeline, the Forcados, Trans-Forcados pipeline was down. At some point in time, you had the SBM that's operated by SPDC was down. For nearly 1.5 months, we didn't produce anything. And I can say that probably will be true for all of us who are operating in that area, who are putting crude oil in that system. It goes back to the point of infrastructure that Ruben raised. The level of infrastructure, the non-maintenance, makes them very, very, very prone to break down. For 1.5 months, we didn't export anything. That's come out of whatever the volumes that the Nigerian government should give it. Now, in the Eastern Delta, it's a different story. And one cannot but applaud Mr. Wike for what he's doing. Although when I hear things like that Senator Enang said, I just feel, I feel disarmed, because like one of my bosses, Joe Kongo, used to say, sometimes we behave like people who have committed lobotomy. Our brains have been taken out and we can't reason correctly. To say you want to begin to give crude oil to illegal, well, so-called illegal refiners. The sheer damage to the environment, which is just manifesting itself in the black suit that Mr. Wike saw before he began to make his move. These are the difficult things that we are faced with. Anybody who was operating in the Eastern Delta, throughout 2021, you would have lost half of your production to crude oil theft. Shell can provide you with the numbers, because they are the ones who manage that TNP, the line that goes to Bonny. So we can't meet the quota, not because at the production end we cannot. Yes, there are challenges on the production side, but given the prices we are seeing, we are putting all the technology that we can in to be sure we can produce. But when you produce and you lose 90% of your production along the line between your producing location, your flow station from which you are producing, to the terminal, it's Nigeria that is being bled to death. And eventually, you can understand why the majors why they are leaving Nigeria. It's just that there's so much lawlessness, and the consequential damage to the environment are things that their own shareholders cannot live with. It appears that we can live with it. I say it appears, but how long can we do that?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Oladele, for joining us this morning. We thank you very much indeed.